The debrief was scheduled for 09:00 at Kandahar Airfield, November 2009. Two senior American officers had flown in from Bagram specifically for it. The request had come through official channels, with all the correct language, a comparative operational assessment of U.S. and U.K. Special Forces performance in the Helmand province during the preceding 14 months. Standard procedure. Routine joint force evaluation. The Delta Force lieutenant colonel who was supposed to lead the briefing walked into the room, looked at the assembled officers, and said he would not be doing it. Not because the assessment was classified, not because the data was incomplete, not because he was protecting the operational security of a running mission. Because, in his words, there was nothing useful he could say about British Special Forces performance in Helmand that would not simply embarrass everyone in the room who had not been there. He had been there. He had watched what happened when the SAS moved through the green zone at night without the technology platforms that American doctrine considered non-negotiable. He had read the after-action reports from operations in which a four-man British patrol had tracked, fixed, and finished a Taliban IED cell, whose location had resisted 6 weeks of American ISR effort. He had sat in joint planning sessions where the British operators proposed approaches that violated every principle of American risk management methodology, and then executed them perfectly in conditions that his own medical officers had certified as too dangerous for unsupported personnel. He refused the brief. The two visiting officers went back to Bagram with nothing. This is the story of what he had seen in Helmand that made him make that decision, and what it tells us about the difference between having the best equipment in the world and being the best soldiers in the world. To understand what the SAS were doing in Helmand between 2007 and 2010, you have to understand what Helmand was. Helmand province was not Iraq. It was not the urban counterterrorism environment for which the American direct action machine had been refined over a decade of operational deployment. It was a riverine agricultural district in the southwest of Afghanistan, a network of irrigation canals, poppy fields, mud-walled compounds, and dense vegetation that the local population called the Green Zone, that combined the physical difficulty of jungle warfare with the tactical complexity of an enemy that had been fighting in this specific terrain against foreign invaders for generations. The Taliban in Helmand in 2008 were not the Islamic State financial network in Baghdad. They were not primarily a target set to be found through signals intelligence and finished through direct action. They were a population-embedded insurgency that had grown up in this terrain, understood its every drainage ditch and compound wall, and had developed a tactical methodology specifically designed to defeat the technology advantages that Western forces relied upon. They fought at night, but not in the way that night vision was designed to counter. They moved through the green zone in small groups using routes that overhead surveillance could not persistently cover. They communicated through a courier system that generated no electronic signature. They knew the ground at a level of granular local detail that no intelligence database could replicate. And they had been doing it for long enough that their counter-surveillance methodology, developed empirically, through direct engagement with every foreign force that had entered this ground since the Soviet era, was sophisticated beyond anything the threat assessments had anticipated. The American approach to Helmand was built on the tools that had worked in Iraq: persistent aerial surveillance, signals intelligence, a comprehensive targeting database, and the rapid direct action tempo that had dismantled the AQI network in the Anbar and Baghdad environments. In Helmand, those tools worked differently. The terrain defeated persistent aerial surveillance in the green zone. The courier communication system generated nothing for signals intelligence to work with. The local population, which in Iraq had gradually shifted toward cooperation with coalition forces as AQI became more brutal, in Helmand remained largely unwilling to provide the human intelligence that complemented the technical picture. And the direct-action tempo that had worked against an urban cell network encountered a different problem in Helmand. The Taliban were not in safe houses. They were in the same compounds, walking the same paths, living in the same communities as the civilian population they had grown up with. The precision that defined the American model in Iraq translated into a very different operational equation in the Helmand Green Zone. The British had been fighting in Helmand since 2006. Not comfortably, not without cost. The campaign had been more difficult, more attritional, and more costly in British lives than the political framing of the deployment had prepared the public for. But in that difficulty, the British Special Forces units operating in Helmand had been developing an operational methodology that was calibrated to what the environment actually demanded rather than to what the doctrine said was possible. The British Special Forces presence in Helmand operated under the command structure of Task Force Helmand, but its methodology was distinct from the broader British military effort in a way that was not always visible from the outside. The SAS elements working the Helmand operational theater between 2007 and 2010 were not primarily running direct-action raids in the American sense. They were doing something more complex, more patient, and in the specific conditions of Helmand, considerably more effective. They were going into the ground. The term is SAS shorthand for the establishment of long-duration observation, posts in close proximity to Taliban activity, positions held for days or weeks at a time, in terrain and conditions that the American risk calculus did not sanction, with the specific purpose of building the kind of ground-level human intelligence picture that no platform could generate from altitude. In the Helmand Green Zone, this meant operating in the irrigation network, the ditches, culverts, and channels that ran between the poppy fields and compound walls, and provided the only concealed movement routes through terrain that was otherwise completely open from above. It meant establishing observation positions inside the Green Zone itself, within listening distance of Taliban activity, in conditions of heat and insects, and absolute physical discomfort that had no parallel in any American operational welfare standard. It meant operating at night without the full sensor and surveillance package that American doctrine considered essential for operations in contested terrain. Not because the British did not have access to technology. The question of access was more complex than that. But because the SAS operational philosophy in Helmand had reached a conclusion that was, from the American perspective, almost incomprehensible. The technology was sometimes a liability. This requires explanation. In the Helmand Green Zone at night, a British four-man patrol moving without the full American technology package, without the aerial ISR overhead, without the persistent surveillance coordination, without the communications architecture that American doctrine considered non-negotiable, generated a footprint that the Taliban counter-surveillance network could not detect. The absence of the technology signature was itself a form of concealment. The Taliban in Helmand had learned to read the signatures of a technologically dependent force. The patrol overflights, the specific pattern of communications that preceded American operations, the thermal management practices that gave away a heated patrol base in cold night air. A British patrol moving through the Green Zone with what, from the American perspective, looked like dangerously minimal support generated none of those signatures. What it relied on instead was something that the American system had no procurement program for. It relied on the individual soldier's ability to navigate, to read ground, to make tactical decisions without the support of a command architecture, and to sustain physical and psychological function in conditions of isolation and danger for periods that exceeded anything the American system had designed its personnel to manage. It relied on selection, on what the Brecon Beacons in January had found in these men before training had begun to build on it. The Delta Force lieutenant colonel who refused the 2009 debrief had been attached to the British Special Forces element in Helmand for a 6-week period in mid-2008. The attachment was part of a broader bilateral exchange arrangement designed to improve interoperability between American and British Special Operations Forces in the Afghan theater. It educated him in a way the arrangement had not anticipated. The first thing he noticed was the planning process. American Special Operations planning in Afghanistan in 2008 was a layered, time-consuming, resource-intensive procedure that reflected the institutional commitment to minimizing risk through comprehensive preparation. Intelligence collection, target development, pattern of life analysis, route planning, rehearsal, ISR confirmation, communications architecture verification. A sequence of steps that, in the American system, could not be abbreviated without formal command authority and documented risk acceptance. The British planning process, as he observed it, was not faster because it was less thorough. It was faster because it was built around a different conception of what preparation actually required. Where the American system used technology to reduce tactical uncertainty before the patrol departed, the British system trained the individual operator to manage uncertainty during the operation. The American approach asked, "What do we know?" and built a preparation process around acquiring enough knowledge to reduce the unknown to an acceptable minimum before committing forces. The British approach asked a different question. What do our best operators need to know to handle what they encounter, whatever it is? The answer to that second question was considerably less than the answer to the first. The second thing he noticed was the night operations. Delta Force is one of the most technically proficient night fighting organizations in the world. Its operators have access to the most advanced night vision equipment available, the most comprehensive aerial surveillance support, and a communications architecture specifically designed to maximize individual operator awareness and command responsiveness during low-light operations. The SAS in Helmand at night were doing something different. They were moving through the green zone, often in 4-man patrols, with equipment that the Delta officer described in his private notes as deliberately minimal. Not inadequate, the British operators were not poorly equipped, but operating at a standard of technological support that reflected a deliberate doctrinal choice rather than a resource limitation. And they were doing things that the American doctrine said were not possible without the technology. On the third night of his attachment, the Delta officer observed a British 4-man patrol conduct a close target reconnaissance of a Taliban command position in the green zone, moving through an irrigation ditch in darkness, covering approximately 800 meters of contested terrain, holding an observation position for 4 hours within 60 meters of active Taliban personnel, and extracting without compromise. The operation had no ISR overhead. It had no helicopter standby. It had minimal communications traffic. In the American system, the absence of those elements would have required a formal risk waiver at general officer level. In the British system, it required 4 men who had passed selection. He watched this and later noted, "I spent 6 weeks in Helmand with the British asking myself what we had been spending the money on." The Delta officer's observation touches on something that the American Special Operations Establishment found deeply uncomfortable and has never fully resolved. The technology advantage that the American system had built, at enormous cost, over 2 decades of post-Cold War investment, was not neutral in its effects on the individual operator. It had made American Special Operations Forces extraordinarily capable in the environments for which it was designed. Urban counterterrorism operations, where signals intelligence and persistent surveillance could identify and track a target set operating within a detectable electronic signature. Direct action operations, where the ability to arrive with overwhelming ISR support and precision fires reduced the margin of individual operator judgment required to execute successfully. And large-scale operations, where the coordination of multiple simultaneous forces across a complex battle space required the communications architecture that American doctrine provided. In the Helmand Green Zone at night, the technology did different things. The ISR overhead that in Baghdad had been a decisive advantage, in Helmand generated acoustic and visual signatures that the Taliban counter-surveillance network had learned to read. The communications architecture that in Iraq had coordinated simultaneous raids across a city, in Helmand created the electronic pattern that preceded a coalition operation and gave a well-prepared adversary enough warning to relocate or prepare an ambush. And the comprehensive preparation process that in the counterterrorism environment had ensured that operators arrived at a target with a near-complete intelligence picture. In Helmand produced a pace of operations that was slower than the environment required. The SAS in Helmand had solved this problem not by acquiring better technology, but by developing operators who did not require the technology to function. This is harder to explain than it sounds. It is not a celebration of primitivism. The British operators in Helmand used technology when it was available and when it was operationally appropriate. What was different was the doctrinal baseline, the minimum individual capability on which the operational system was built. The American system was built on the assumption that the individual operator would have ISR support, communications architecture, and intelligence preparation as baseline conditions of operation. Remove those conditions and the system's capability declined proportionally. The British system was built on the assumption that the individual operator might have none of those things and trained accordingly. Add technology and capability increased. Remove it and capability declined from a much higher floor. In the Helmand Green Zone, that floor was what mattered. Brigadier Ed Butler, who commanded British forces in Helmand during some of the most intense fighting of the campaign, described the SAS operational methodology in terms that captured this distinction precisely. The American system, he said, was like a Formula One car extraordinary capability, dependent on an entire infrastructure of support to operate at its design performance level. The British system was built around a driver who could make a Land Rover go faster than most people could drive a sports car. The driver was what selection built. The operational record in Helmand that the Delta officer observed during his attachment included 3 specific examples that defined his understanding of what the British system produced. The first was in the Sangin Valley, summer 2008. American ISR assets had been working a Taliban IED cell in the Upper Sangin district for 6 weeks. The cell was responsible for 11 IED emplacement events and 3 coalition fatalities. The targeting file was comprehensive: locations, personnel, movement patterns. But the cell had demonstrated a consistent ability to detect imminent coalition operations and relocate before the raid element arrived. 6 weeks of collection, 6 weeks of movement intelligence, 6 weeks of preparation, and the cell remained active and unlocated. A 2-man SAS reconnaissance team was tasked against the cell. They inserted on foot into the Sangin Valley Green Zone at night, without ISR overhead, and established a hide position in an irrigation ditch 120 meters from the compound network the cell was using. They held the position for 11 days. On day 8, they identified the cell's primary IED preparation site, a compound that had not appeared in the American intelligence file because it was accessed through a canal route invisible from any aerial observation angle. On day 11, they had a complete pattern of life on the cell's movement and preparation cycle. The raid, conducted by a 4-man SAS assault element with a supporting British infantry platoon, achieved complete surprise. The cell was neutralized. The IED preparation site was found exactly where the reconnaissance team had reported it, with materials sufficient for 40 additional devices. The second was in the Musakala district, Autumn 2008. A Taliban district commander, a figure whose capture or removal had been assessed as likely to significantly degrade Taliban coordination in northern Helmand, had been on the ISAF targeting list for 4 months. 2 American-led operations against him had been compromised before they reached the strike phase. The target's counter-surveillance methodology was described in the intelligence file as anomalously sophisticated for a provincial-level commander, meaning he had a network of early warning assets that detected the preparation signatures of coalition operations before they executed. The SAS approach to this target was different from the American approach in a single, fundamental way. They did not begin with the target. They began with the ground. A 3-man SAS patrol spent 5 days moving through the districts in which the target was known to operate, building a ground-level picture of his movement patterns and the geography of his operational area. They did not carry the target file. They carried a notebook and a set of grid references, and the accumulated experience of operators who had been moving through this landscape long enough to understand how a man trying to remain invisible would use it. On day 5, they identified the compound he was using as his primary base of operations, not from signals, not from human intelligence, not from aerial surveillance, from the pattern of foot traffic around a compound that was conspicuously less active than its neighbors, a building that the local population was apparently being careful not to look at. The district commander was detained, without a shot fired 8 hours later. The third was in the Garmsir district, spring 2009. A Taliban logistic route running from the Pakistani border through the Garmsir corridor into the southern Helmand distribution network had been assessed as the primary resupply chain for Taliban operations across the province. The route had been under aerial surveillance for 3 months. The surveillance had confirmed the route existed. It had not produced the specific targeting detail needed to interdict it effectively, because the route used a combination of human couriers and animal transport on paths too narrow and too numerous to track persistently from altitude. The SAS solution was to walk the route. A 4-man patrol spent 8 days moving parallel to the logistic corridor, building a ground-level map of every transfer point, every cache location, and every human node in the distribution network. They did not use the aerial surveillance data as their primary intelligence source. They used their eyes, their feet, and 8 days of patient observation from positions that the courier network passed within meters of without detecting. The interdiction operation that followed dismantled 14 months of logistic infrastructure in a single 48-hour period. The Delta Force lieutenant colonel who refused the November 2009 debrief was not, by any account of those who knew him, a man given to institutional gestures. He was a professional who had spent 15 years at the highest level of American special operations, deployed to Iraq, Afghanistan, and multiple other operational theaters, with considerable institutional credibility to spend or preserve. His refusal was not a gesture, it was a professional assessment. What he had understood in Helmand, watching the SAS operate in conditions his own doctrine said required technology support that was absent, was something about the relationship between capability and the architecture built to support it. The American system had built an extraordinary architecture. It had built persistent surveillance, precision fires, comprehensive intelligence fusion, and the most capable direct action force in history. And then, and this was the part that his 6 weeks in Helmand had made uncomfortably clear, it had trained its operators to operate within that architecture rather than independently of it. The architecture was the capability. Remove it, and the individual operator's residual capacity was high. Delta operators were among the best soldiers in the world, but it was not calibrated to the floor that the British system had built because it had never needed to be. The architecture was always there. In the Helmand Green Zone, the architecture was sometimes a liability. And what was left when you set it aside? The individual, with his training and his instinct and the specific quality that no platform could replicate, was the thing the British had been building since a hospitalized lieutenant wrote a memo in Cairo in 1941. The Delta officer understood that producing a briefing comparing American and British Special Forces performance in Helmand would require him to explain this, and explaining it, in a formal institutional setting, to officers whose careers were built on the architecture he was implicitly critiquing, was not something he was prepared to do. Not because it would be politically uncomfortable, because he did not think the institution was ready to hear it. What he said instead, privately, to the two officers who had come from Bagram, was that British Special Forces performance in Helmand was not comparable to American Special Forces performance in Helmand, not because one was better than the other in any general sense, but because they were operating from different doctrinal foundations in an environment that happened to reward one foundation more than the other. The British foundation was the individual. The American foundation was the system. In Helmand, he said, the system was sometimes in the way. The Helmand campaign ended badly for everyone. The province that British and American forces had fought over for the better part of a decade was largely under Taliban control by 2022. The institutional lessons that the Delta officer and others took from the campaign did not translate into systemic change in the way that the operational evidence might have justified. But in the specific, contained world of professional special operations, the question that Helmand posed has not gone away. It is the question that the Delta officer was refusing to brief about in November 2009. The question about what you are when you set the architecture down, about whether the individual capability, the floor, not the ceiling, is high enough for the environment to function in. The SAS answer to that question runs from the Brecon Beacons in January, through continuation training in Belize and Hereford, and a dozen other training environments, through decades of operational deployment in every kind of terrain and against every kind of adversary, to a four-man patrol moving through an irrigation ditch in the Sangin Green Zone at night with no ISR overhead and no helicopter standby, and a notebook, and a pair of eyes, and the specific quality that the mountain had found in them before any of the training had begun. The American answer is different, not worse. The American system has produced results that no other military organization has approached, but different, built on a different premise about what the individual is for and what the architecture is for. In Helmand, in the Green Zone, in the specific conditions of that specific campaign, the SAS premise was more useful. The Delta officer knew this. He had spent 6 weeks watching it. He had read the after-action reports. He had sat in the joint planning sessions and observed the two methodologies operating alongside each other in the same operational environment and reaching different conclusions about what was possible and what was necessary. He refused the debrief because a comparative assessment would have required him to say, in a formal institutional setting, what he was prepared to say only informally. That in Helmand, the SAS were doing things his people could not do. Not because they had better equipment. Not because they had better intelligence. Not because they had better doctrine, in any theoretical sense. Because they had operators who had been found, on a Welsh mountain in January, to be the kind of men who could function without all of that. Who could lie in an irrigation ditch for 11 days in the Sangin Valley with insects and heat, and the knowledge that a mistake would mean dying in a field in southern Afghanistan, and come out with the intelligence picture that 6 weeks of American ISR had not been able to build. We had night vision, he later said. They had instinct. He paused. In that valley at that time, instinct was worth more. Somewhere in the Brecon Beacons right now, in January cold and driving sleet, A man is moving alone across a high exposed ridge with 25 kilograms on his back. He has been walking for 10 hours. He will walk for another 7. He does not know what the mountain is about to show him about himself. Neither does anyone else. If the answer is the right one, he will spend years learning to do things that the architecture cannot do. And somewhere, in an irrigation ditch in a place no one has named yet, in a campaign no one has started yet, that will be the thing that matters.